Hello, this is Neil, and I'm going to give a short tutorial on how to use the Solo Contuti app. The first thing you see when you'll start up for the first time is the wizard, which will help you set up Solo Contuti. On the first page, you have two fields, a name, so I'll fill in a name. This is what other users will see when they have a session with you. That's the name they'll see. And your email address, and I'll type in an email. The email address is not absolutely necessary, but it's very useful. When you send a trouble report or a crash dump, it enables us to get in contact with you to help solve the problem and to get more information about the problem. Now, the next page you see is a sound test. So you can see I'm talking, the meter's moving, so that seems to be working all right. You can click on that to get a test signal, so I'll be quiet now and show what happens. So you can see we've got a left channel but not a right channel. That's actually the setup I have on this machine. If it's not working or if something's going wrong, if you want stereo, you can click here to change the settings. And there are various device type settings available depending upon the sort of system you're on and what is available. These settings are not available on Android or iOS because you don't have these choices. So let's get out of this. This is working, so we'll go to the next one. This one actually checks the device latency. So it works out by measuring what the latency is between sound coming in and sound going out. So let's do this. And we see I have a latency of 30 milliseconds, which is pretty high. Let's try it again. Yeah, it's still about 30 milliseconds. There's actually a fairly high audio latency, and it's more or less standard for this particular computer. Normally, I'd use a USB device, which has a much, much lower latency in the 2 to 3 millisecond range. Then we go to the next one. This is going to test your network. And we're starting the test. It's going to go through a number of tests. First thing is, can we establish a connection with other Solo Contuti users? Normally, yes. And how good is the connectivity? Measured connectivity is very good, 100%. That says how reliable the connectivity is. And for technical reasons, it can't actually measure the latency, but normally this will tell you what the latency is to a server. Now, this currently measures the latency to a server in Europe. So if you're much outside of Europe, this test doesn't work and you have to use the latency when you're online. This is going to be fixed in a later version. And then we're done with the wizard and you can use Solo Contuti. So the first thing you need with Solo Contuti is to understand the basic controls. So you have, on your side, you have two inputs. You have your main input, which is potentially stereo, and you have a second input, which currently is only mono. And these are connected to your input devices. And if you look at preferences, you can see how these connections are made. So I have my input devices, and I've only got one input channel, but potentially I could choose more. If I was to choose, for example, the 64 channel, I have a lot more choices. And that's my input channel. And again, I can choose, do I want stereo or not? That's a choice I have. And you can test if you're, now this particular one isn't working. You can test on this panel if that's working. You can actually have extra input. So for example, I could choose input 1 or some other input. This is actually meant for cases when you have an instrument that is stereo and is taking up two channels, and you want to have another line to attach, say, a microphone, which you could use to talk to other players when your main instrument is taking up all the available channels. But you could use it to attach another instrument if you really wanted to. And there's some settings here which I think are fairly obvious. What sampling rate are we using? How big is the buffer size? What compression are we using? The buffer size parameter is, I would recommend trying 96 if it works. We can test if this works well. If you hear crackling, your system can't handle it, but keep this low as possible. The lower the buffer size, the lower latency you get as a result of buffers. And this, you'll see 96 samples gives 2 milliseconds latency. And this is compression. Normally speaking, I would keep it at 3. It gives good quality and it doesn't take a lot of bandwidth. But if you don't have a lot of bandwidth to go, you can have the compression higher. So we'll leave this screen. So these are the controls for the two inputs we just set up. And obviously this controls the input gain, which is what other people will hear on both channels. You can, for all of these controls, you can split the input controls so that you can control each stereo channel separately. That's with this button. Some devices have a fairly quiet input. I have a microphone which I use here, which is a very quiet input, so you can boost it by 5 decibels here. You can see immediately this is being boosted just by clicking the boost button. And how you want to monitor, you might want to monitor through your device, but you can also monitor through Solo Contuti. Make sure you're using headphones, which I wasn't when you do this, otherwise you get this horrible echo going through your thing. So all these controls, the input controls have these possibilities: gain control, monitor, boost, splitting, etc. There's a separate control for the plugin. This is dealt with in another video, but basically you can take input from a plugin which you can use to plug in for basically any other piece of software which will accept plugins, and that means you can connect Solo Contuti to just about anything you want to. And here we have a metronome. Metronome has two controls: the metronome beats per second, and the volume that you will hear the metronome. Now, when you start a metronome, everybody you're playing with, the metronome runs at the same speed and at the same time, irrespective of latency. They're synchronized to go in exactly the same time. So a very useful feature, particularly for very high latencies. Down here, we have the main controls of the app. I'll come to start and join in a minute. Video is fairly obvious. You can have video connection with one channel. The reason it's only one channel is because otherwise the bandwidth would be too great, and the video is not actually intended as a replacement for Zoom. It's intended for teachers that want to play along with their pupils and also want to be able to see their pupils and demonstrate things to their pupils. It's not fully synchronized to the sound. That's not really possible with this sort of technology. So it's really only meant as a teaching aid and not as a replacement as a sort of low latency Zoom or whatever. There's a recording button. The recording button allows you to basically record what you're playing, and you can choose to record the whole sound, the whole mix of what you're playing with, everybody you're playing with, or you can just choose to record your particular sound. Now, why would you want to do that? Because if you're, say, playing with 5 or 6 people, there will be loss of quality due to the compression. There will be loss of quality due to glitches in the network. You can play together fine, but the sound quality recording isn't going to be as good as you can get. So what you can do is you can all play together and do a record local, so that you can later, at the highest possible available quality, remix your recording which you made live remote. The next one here is just a simple mute button, which means, and you see there's nothing happening here, you're basically muting all your inputs so that you can do something else or take yourself offline for a minute. Now, these two buttons control sessions. Let's start talking about these two. Start. When you hit start, I need to pull this over so you can actually see it. When you hit start, you will contact the server, and the server will give you a code. You send this code to other players in the session, WhatsApp, mail, Telegram, whatever you're using, and that will allow them to join the session. And what you see here is this is being copied to the clipboard, so you can just do Control V or Command V or paste to copy it into a message instead of having to type it over again. And if you want to, you can also copy it with the Control C or Command C from here. Now, when somebody on the other end gets, I'm going to stop this, so I can click on stop here to stop the session. So I'm no longer in the session. The session still exists. I just left it. You can join the session again by hitting your code, and there you go. You're back in the session. And of course, the other thing that happens is that if you send the other code, the code to somebody else, and they add this in join, they will also be in the session, of course. Now we see somebody's actually joined the session, but they don't have a connection because we have this red blinking light, and it may take a little time for the connection to actually get going. Now, this light goes to green, and as soon as it's green, you'll have a connection. This tells you the latency, This latency is moving about a bit, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20 milliseconds. In this particular test version, I'm actually using a particularly bad line, so it's jumping around a lot. But this latency will tell you a combination of network latency and buffer latency. So it's not just the amount of time you're spending on the latency in the network, but it's also the amount of time that things need to be buffered to maintain a consistent sound quality. And Silicon 2D does this. It works out some intelligent buffering to retain consistent sound quality, and at some point this will roughly stabilize. So I'm roughly stabilizing at 30 milliseconds latency, which is fair enough. And I'm in connection. What you can see is I can actually control the volume coming in from the other side, and I can choose to pan the volume in my space left to right. And of course, I'm always getting a stereo signal. I can choose to move this stereo signal around in the space if I want to, and I can choose to separately control the stereo inputs. And that's really all there is to it. There are some more functions which are described in various tutorials. There's a fairly extensive manual online. There's a couple of documents describing how to tune Silicon 2D to get minimal latency and maximum quality. That's probably a good place to stop.